This webinar was recorded for subrecipients of the Tennessee Strong Families Grant on April 21st, 2026. Amber Ware, licensed clinical mental health counselor and licensed professional counselor, who is a LifeSet licensed program expert at Youth Villages, was our subject matter expert presenter. The roles of both supervisors and team members in professional development settings were discussed, along with the key components and stages of development. Broader, team development was emphasized in its impact on organizational and program effectiveness. The slides and reference materials are posted on our webpage for your reference and review.
Great to be here. And like Brooke said, that's kind of why I was invited as Youth Villages. That's one of their kind of core concepts is they want to support their staff on growing themselves personally and professionally. So what that looks like is maybe different from your organization. So hopefully today just gives you a little bit of a taste of what development could look like and gives you some ideas on what you can do to support your organization and your team that you work within. So I asked Brooke to let me know if there's any questions in the chat because I'm going to intentionally ignore that. So if I'm ignoring your question for a very long time, I apologize. But I know we do have a lot to get through today, and hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for some questions at the end. So overall training goals for today, just want to explain what is the purpose of development. So what does it do? What is the value of it? How you can help build trust within your team, support each individual team member's growth, and improve upon retention. Second part is the longest. It's the meat and potatoes of what is development? How do you set expectations? How are you assessing your staff members' performance and improving upon their ability to meet those job expectations? The third is how do we take this development and knowing and understanding your job and grow it into how do we help you achieve all of your personal professional goals, as well as strengthen the leadership capacity within your organization. So improving the program's effectiveness, the organization's effectiveness, and supporting their individual growth within their professional goals. So we're going to be talking a lot about that today. That's hopefully what we get through. I am curious, just when I say development, if that is sparks any ideas, like what does development mean to you all? So you all can feel free to come off mute or just answer in the chat. When I say development, what does that mean to you? So growth and learning are definitely big pieces of development. So it's that ties back, and I know that we have a lot of different roles in this setting right now. So I'm not familiar with all of your different programs, but as a LPC and LCMHC, that ties back to professional counselor ethics, and so that ethic around continuing education and continued growth. And so I think that's what makes development a little bit different than just a weekly check-in, or I think there are probably staff in this room who don't even have a weekly check-in with their direct supervisor. Maybe it's not even monthly. So I did prior to coming to Youth Villages, and I'm sorry if you hear my dog in the background. She decided to eat her breakfast right at this exact moment. So prior to coming to Youth Villages, I worked in an individual outpatient therapy setting. So I did have pretty consistent meetings because I was brand new coming out of grad school with my direct supervisor, but that was very client focused. After my initial expectations of how do I do a note, how do I do a treatment plan, how do I make sure that my I's are dotted and my T's are crossed, there wasn't really anything around personal growth and goals for myself. It was just like a check-in, making sure you're okay. And so that's where Youth Villages has taught me that development can be more focused on how do you grow yourself and really thinking about how that lines up with not only your job expectations, but your long-term success as a person. So we're moving into the goal for this first section, which is just to review explain the purpose and value of development meetings. The three pieces of development we're looking at having collaborative meetings. So it's not just I come in as your supervisor with an agenda. You're getting input from the staff member on what do they want to work on, what do they see as their needs, and also engaging them to be aligned to the goals that you as a manager have. So if you're seeing a need area, it's like you're having that collaboration to work on a goal that you both agreed upon, or multiple goals that you've agreed upon. It's consistent. So ideally on a weekly basis. Of course, that's not always doable for every organization, and that's okay. But that cadence is important because lack of consistency just communicates it's not important to you. So if you have a leader who's canceling your weekly meeting 3 out of 4 times, that's saying, oh, I guess that's not really important that they really want to meet with me. So part of that is having a consistent rhythm and keeping to that rhythm. And then it's transparent. So it's having that open conversation about needs. You're including not only like yourself as a manager, but even like leadership team oversight, from your leadership, like what they see. But it also includes a systematic review of strengths and needs, including feedback from observations and assessments. Maybe you have like a customer satisfaction survey. So it's taking what you might get as some critical feedback and making sure that you're presenting it to them and being transparent about those concerns, because these needs are important to be addressed, but they're development opportunities. They're not weaknesses. So how do we address those and work on a plan together? Because it's important for us to address those, and it's something that you as a supervisor manager are here to support them on growing so that they can improve upon those need areas. So, development is important for a lot of reasons. The first being relationship building. It's important. Relationship building is the foundation for trust, which helps facilitate difficult, crucial conversations. So, if you're coming in from the beginning and just telling them what to do and you're not asking them about themselves, you might be promoting this idea that they're just kind of like a cog in the machine. And so you want to have that foundational relationship because it leads to a productive work environment over time. And so that might include diverting to personal topics within appropriate work limits. So, but that relationship, again, it's important to see that they're more than just a worker, they're a part of your team and you all are in this together. And that relationship building helps also lead to successful outcomes because when you have that foundation to have those difficult conversations about needs, then you're able to address how you can be most successful in your programs. So, program effectiveness is generated when our staff have the skills to do their jobs successfully. And if they aren't willing to have those transparent conversations about the need areas they're seeing, we might not have a chance to have the most successful outcomes we could. Retention is another area why it can be helpful to have development. So, retaining positive staff helps programs grow, builds on their effectiveness and success. And so, you want to retain staff who are good at their job and helping grow your program. And so, how do we help that? It's, that consistency with development is important, but also that alignment to their long term personal professional goals helps them want to stick around and hopefully be satisfied in their job. And if they are wanting to move on, they're also moving on in a way that is, helped by us as far as like helping them move into maybe a leadership opportunity in organization or onto a path that kind of fits what they've long term wanted to do. And so it's kind of a parting of the ways in a better way than they just get burnt out and they leave and put in their notice and say peace. And the last is just that promoting that growth mindset. So it goes back to our professional ethics, like I was mentioning before. So we want to be continuing to adapt, continuing to learn, and having a meeting focused on your staff's growth communicates that it's important for you to see them growing. It's important for your organization to see them growing, that we're all growing together to a greater good. So we have a few different goals for our development. So individual team member growth. So we're creating a comprehensive plan supporting the staff's individual goals. So that includes personal and professional goals, but also understanding, goals around what, expectations, struggles, and how they can be most successful in their work too. So it's not just their personal and professional, it's also helping them be successful at the job tasks and responsibilities that go day to day. The leadership development, or at Youth Villages, we like to call that succession planning. So I never heard that term prior to coming to Youth Villages. I don't know if that's a common term, but it's the who's going to take your place when you're done here. It's not done as in like you've left the organization, but there's this, again, intentional planning for we're going to grow and we're going to have people moving up into, higher from a supervisor to a regional supervisor to an assistant director. And so someone's going to have to eventually take your place because you're going to grow into a bigger and better position. So who is that on your team? Who are those capable team members? How do we support those staff in cultivating the skills that they're going to need in order to be eligible and successful in a future leadership opportunity? It just helps you plan for organizational growth and leadership shifts. And so that's an important piece of development, is hopefully finding the person who's going to successfully take your position when you're moved up. The last, organizational effectiveness. So it's not just quantity of work being done, that you're checking the box that you got that note in, but it's quality of work being done by your staff. So not just that they're doing the job, but they're doing it well. Managers who have that consistency in meetings are communicating that are responsible for communicating job expectations. They're honest, providing direct feedback, in a way that's hopefully supportive of staff's growth and collaborative, of course, too. So when you talk about organization or program effectiveness, we have a few key parts. So we're wanting to, of course, initially train on job-specific duties, right? They've got to know exactly what are they responsible for doing, how are they supposed to do that, how, what are the tips and tricks, what are the timelines in which they need to complete things. And then once you've set that expectation, what's the barrier to that? So, how do we overcome anything that is getting in the way of them meeting an expectation that's been set for them? But organization effectiveness also translates to professionalism. I'm assuming that you all have clients that you're interacting with, and maybe in an office setting, but maybe in a community-based setting. There might be some other key players that you're interacting with. Maybe you're interacting in a community organization that brings together providers, or we want to provide a role model for professionalism. So, how do you speak with other people in a professional way? How do you engage in difficult conversations in a professional way? How are you maintaining the integrity of your organization? And that's definitely something that goes into having an effective organization and program. So, that is a piece of that effectiveness. And then, of course, the main goal of all of this is having successful outcomes for the programs that you all are doing. So, ties back to when you have staff who are good at their job, they're meeting expectations, they're successful with their clients, that is going to generate growth of your program and generate, that we all want to meet that goal that we set out with our program. And so hopefully that's the end goal of all of our development of our staff. So now we're getting into the meat and potatoes, but any initial questions about the why behind on why development is important and why it's valuable for staff?
We're all clear for the chat now, so I'll let you know if anything comes up, though.
Okay. So goal number 2 is we're looking at applying structured development strategies to set expectations and assess performance. So we have 3 initial stages of development. So the first is that expectation setting, where you're training on your organization's policies, their procedures, training on the skills that are needed for that position to hopefully get your staff to the point where they can operate pretty independently without direct guidance. That also includes goal setting, so understanding a little bit about their personal and professional goals. And yes, that happens in stage 1 because it is important to establish that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. But then once you've done that initial position-specific guidance, you're moving on to the doing, measuring, building. So they're doing their job. You as the manager are measuring their success within different core competencies, and then building on the skills so they can hopefully improve upon the quality at which they are being successful at meeting expectations. The final stage of development is mastery. So it's applying those skills to further goals outside of their immediate job tasks and responsibilities for the greater good of the organization and beyond. So that can include moving into leadership or leadership development, but it can also be in other ways too. So we'll have a little bit more of that at the end for today. So the development matrix, this is kind of the flow of as we're going through each job responsibility, each specific goal that we're setting. Um, we're first taking time to build upon the relationship. So we're engaging with the staff. We're trying to align them to the goals that we've identified, but also understanding what are those goals that they've identified for themselves. We're relating to them, and then we're assessing the strengths and needs that they have, assessing, what are things that they might lack as far as training needs or other, resources we might need to pull in to support. Then we're prioritizing what is the most important need to address. So the reality is, especially when you have a brand new staff, you can't necessarily train them on every single thing day one of their job. So you want to think about what are the things that they need to know today? What are those things that we can plan for in the coming weeks? And what are those things that we can put off even longer? What can we pull in other supports to help with training needs? So, for example, youth villages, you have your initial orientation when you come in that kind of orients you to the company. And it's the same orientation no matter if you're a receptionist or you're a direct, line staff or you're someone in my position. Um, and then there are program specific trainings. So OJT, on the job training, modules, there's face to face, clinical foundation. So where you're looking at more of how do you put in a treatment plan. And so there's some training things that are outside of the direct supervisor. Not every organization is like that, right? But you might have some kind of flavor to that. So there are things that are being done maybe by other people as far as training needs, and then there are things that you yourself as the direct manager have to train on. So taking what can be accomplished by someone else and then prioritizing what needs to be directly addressed by me first and foremost. So at youth villages, the clinical supervisor is responsible for how do you put in a session note? How do you work our behavioral health chart? How do you get over the frustration when the behavioral health chart doesn't work exactly the way you want it to, which is often. So that's kind of their initial things. And then, of course, they're building upon that in conjunction with some other trainings. So you want to consider what's, again, the most important thing, and then understand, if there are some barriers to implementing an expectation, what are those barriers so we can hopefully plan around those. And then when that moves you into the last stage, which is making a plan for developing a skill. So maybe you can't just train on that once. Maybe there's a rhythm to that. They need to talk about it face to face, and they need to go see it in action, and then they need to do it for themselves. So what does that plan look like for implementation? And then the staff implements the plan with their direct supervisor support in whatever way that means. So maybe that's the supervisor shadowing, or maybe that's them going out on their own and you're kind of evaluating after the fact. So they do the action and evaluate how that plan went, and then kind of tweak the plan as needed. So your stage one, you're setting those expectations and establishing your initial goals. So you're understanding what their expectations are and their goals for themselves, as well as having your own expectations and goals for your staff member. Um, so it starts with guidance. So ideally, you're providing written, specific expectations to your team members. And part of the reason it needs to be written is just goes back to documentation. So we're going to talk in a little bit about development plans and the importance of documentation. But for anyone in mental health land, like we are at youth villages, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so that's where, if you're providing something in a written format, you have it to reference back to versus only in verbal format, that's a little bit harder to combat when someone says, well, you didn't train me on that versus it's written down for them. So, and it's helpful just as a reference and tool for them to reference back to. So being really specific about what do they need to have in place to perform their job successfully. What are the time frames? So for example, at youth villages, you need to complete your session notes within 24 hours. That's a very specific time, measurable. So having that clearly spelled out as far as an expectation is helpful to have written down. We're demonstrating professionalism, so we want to communicate that we take their role seriously. We want them to succeed. And you take your role seriously as the leader of them, as the team leader. And so that it's important for all of us to, as a team, move forward successfully. And then we're listening and connecting. So listening to their concerns they might have about an expectation, assessing are there any gaps in their ability to meet those expectations on the front end, and communicating a plan on how to strengthen those skills. So maybe you have someone who never has worked directly in a program like yours before. Maybe they have some similar experience, but never. I think a great example is when I went from outpatient to youth villages. Even though I did have mental health world experience, the behavioral health chart I worked with previously was vastly different than at youth villages. It's much more comprehensive. And so there was a significant gap in the skills I had to be able to meet those expectations initially. So that required a lot of training needs. So listening, understanding where they're coming from is important when we're starting to set those expectations. And then from the forefront, we want to start with goal setting. So we do want to understand what are their professional goals. We need to make sure we're not just jumping into expectations and direction only. You want to understand from the beginning, where do you hope to end up long term? It helps us understand how can we guide them in that direction from the start. So for example, I started at youth villages. I was seeking hours for my associate licensure, but part of that I needed support with getting established with a licensed clinical supervisor who could be in charge of like my for the state board licensure. And if I didn't get started with that right away, like I did, I would have lost out on hours and hours, 3,000 hours that you have to log for your license. And so I would have lost out on that had my supervisor had not directly asked from the beginning, what are your goals? Let's get you started, because that was something that they were able to support with, is getting me connected with that licensure supervisor within my first month of being at youth villages. Their goal does not have to be directly related to their job expectations. So licensure was the example I gave just now, but maybe they're recognizing, I've really considered wanting to go back to school. I'd like to go for a doctorate. I'd like to go for a master's degree. I've thought about that a lot. So that's maybe something as far as a personal goal. Maybe they have a goal around self-care because they ended up at your organization after getting really burnt out at GCS or something like that, right? So maybe that's a goal they have from the forefront, and that's something that's good to know on the front end so that you're kind of checking in, knowing what those warning signs of burnout are, and you're helping them create a comprehensive self-care plan from the beginning. Or maybe they have a particular interest. Maybe they want to take a training on motivational interviewing, and your organization doesn't offer that, but that's something that you could help connect them to. Maybe they want to become a supervisor. Maybe from the beginning, they know they want to be in your role. So how do we help prepare them from that from the beginning? So they might not have a clear-cut goal, and that's okay. So you can ask some things. Where do you see yourself in a year? Where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And what do you need to get there? Do I, as your supervisor, have that skill set to support you, or do we need to pull in from another place? So like my licensure supervisor was contracted from youth villages, but not directly an employee of youth villages. So is that something that we need to pull in someone else to help you achieve your goals, but we could still be a support in that? So the best goals are SMART goals. So hopefully this is something you have a little bit of familiarity with. So SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So that goes with expectations that you're setting for staff for the job responsibilities, but also thinking about professional goals that they have. So we want to think about how can we make the goals in the development very specific, achievable, considering how do you assign development tasks for them to do outside of your development meeting is important, and putting some time bound. So an easy time bound SMART goal is something that is specific enough and achievable enough to do between your development meetings. So in the next week, for a licensure supervisor, maybe you don't have a contract like youth villages did. So maybe week 1, I'm going to call the board and get a list of licensure supervisors. Then week 2, my step is to identify 3 that I'm interested in. Week 3, I've got to call 1. So you're assigning something that's realistic and doable. And you can make it small like that, but if you're taking time from the very beginning of your development to really sprinkle in their personal and professional goals, that's going to help them see that, again, they're not just a cog in the machine. That it is important that they're continuing on their path of personal growth. At the same time, they are learning their job expectations and being successful in their role. So overall, you are still wanting to know how effective they are being in their job. And you can gather that information from their direct report. So how do you feel like your session went, your meeting went, your whatever that looks like for your organization. But there are also some other tools you have. So first being field observations. I don't know how common that is within your organization and what that could look like for you to start to do that. But joining a session, having a session recorded for you, or an interaction recorded. So getting that direct feedback of how they actually are doing the work that your organization is attempting to do is so incredibly helpful. But you have some other tools available to you as well. So documentation review. I have to assume a lot of your organizations have documentation that they needs to be reviewed. So it's not just the checkbox that they completed the documentation, but looking at it, was it completed correctly? What's the quality of it? So timeliness is important, and that's why we do have those accountability measures. But what are those accountability measures for your staff? So I mentioned treatment notes are due within 24 hours at youth villages. Treatment plans are updated every 4 weeks for LifeSet. So what are those accountability measures that we can help with tracking and help with knowing how effective they are being? And then progress reviews. So performance reviews. I don't know, again, what that looks like within your organization, but I have to imagine that if you are within an organization for any kind of amount of time, you might have like a standardized yearly performance review. And so what does that look like? Are there specific core competencies that you're tracking within that yearly performance review that you could actually take out of that performance review and start to talk about how are they doing within those core competencies along the way, so that they don't get to the end of their progress review at the end of the year and get a big surprise that they are not doing as well as they thought. So again, it goes back to that transparency, but how are you tracking that? Is there a way to take what is maybe a yearly performance review and turn it into a monthly check-in that is giving feedback to your staff on how they're doing? So we're taking all those assessment tools and then we're translating those into hopefully some kind of a development plan. And what this looks like for your organization, maybe you don't have one at all, and that's okay if you don't, but I do want you to consider that if you don't have one, maybe starting one is a good place to go from today, because documenting what you're doing in your weekly, monthly meetings, what other cadence you have is important, because it is helpful for you as the supervisor to track. Maybe you have a staff member who's on the path of progressive discipline. They're not meeting expectations. You're really talking about how they can be most effective. You're trying to problem solve you want to document the efforts that you're making to try and help bring them up to speed. And then if there is something where we're looking at maybe parting ways from the staff member, you have the documentation of all of the things you discussed in your meeting, your agenda for every meeting. And then you also have a place to track those strength and need areas. And I think it's important to have both. You don't want to only focus on the needs. You want to also highlight their strengths because you want them to be building on the strengths that they do have, and you want to have that positive strength focused piece of it too. So it gives you a place to track and also track when they're shifting a need to a strength, which is really cool to demonstrate over time. And you might not be able to do that in the same way if you're not documenting it. The last, it's a place for you to have an outline of where your specific goal steps and timelines. So if they do have this goal of licensure supervision, it's like by the March of 2027, I'd like to be meeting regularly with a licensure supervisor. So by May of 2026, I will call the board to get a list of licensure supervisor. And by July, I'm going to call the board or call one supervisor and set up a meeting, something like that. So it gives you a place to document what you are talking about in your development, and then reference back to as you're trying to hold them accountable to specific timelines for their job responsibility goals, but also their personal and professional goals. Another tool I wanted to talk about was more about those observations, those field visits. So how you do those is just as important as doing them. So if you're not doing them, consider how you might be able to implement that within your organization. But if you are doing them, are you doing them as effectively as you could? So for field visits and observations, it's good practice to talk about that observation before it happens. So in our clinical setting, what's the goal for your session with your LifeSet youth? An example might be that we're supporting them with studying for a permit exam and learning about the expectations that they need, the documentation they need to get their permit when they do have the opportunity to go to the DMV. So set that goal for what the session is, what are those skills that the staff member maybe needs some support with. Maybe they're having a hard time talking to the young person about safety planning. So you've kind of been working in development about strategies that you can use to engage them around safety planning. And so now you're going out to a field visit, and that's one of the goals of this observation is to see what you've worked on in development in action and see, is there anything else that we can do to support? So having that goal ahead of time just helps, again, that transparency of why am I going out to this field visit? And maybe the simple answer is just, I need support with a really difficult case. You want to create measures for tracking progress and success. So is that are there some core competencies that your program is looking at in each client and interaction? So is that something you could scale those core competencies on a scale of 1 to 5 on how successful that staff member is? So think about how you might be able to demonstrate success and kind of track and have like an assessment measure that can be used universally. Within the field visit, you want to take time to note their strengths and needs, even if they are outside of the targeted goal. Again, you're getting really great information by being in those field visits. You want to make sure you're taking time to know the strengths and needs. And then last, you want to make sure you're meeting as soon as possible after the observation to review feedback, just because you don't want to be sitting on a critical need, a critical concern. But you also don't want your staff to maybe build up a little anxiety, feeling like they did something wrong, right? You want to have that transparent conversation as soon as possible. And maybe it's not going to be able to happen the same day, but hopefully planning those observations where you could have a pretty immediate feedback is helpful. So I think that even translates to other settings. I have a best friend who's a teacher, and she had her principal observe her before spring break and then go the whole entire spring break without having any feedback. And it was just a mental stressor because she was just worried endlessly that she did terribly. So you don't want to cause your staff members distress. So help them by meeting with them as soon as possible to review that, and then make sure you're presenting that feedback, seeing which, positive, negative need, then positive, because you do want to highlight those strengths that are there. And even if those are things that you have to really work hard to pull out, you do want to highlight the things that they are doing well, and also have a direct conversation about what those need areas are. So we've gathered some assessment, you've done your training, you're still having struggles with expectations. That's common, right? So your struggles with expectations, want to think about, is there an alternative method or solution for meeting this expectation? So the biggest question is, what is the actual expectation? And are you conceptualizing success as they're doing it exactly the way I taught them to? Or is there a specific outcome that as long as they get to that outcome, then that's okay? So, for example, I have a sister, she runs an expedited trucking business. She has a recruiter. The recruiter, they have a recruiting like system that they can log contact with the potential drivers. It's apparently pretty horrible. So the recruiter was struggling putting in the tasks and the communication in the system. And so the actual goal was just documenting consistent contact with the potential drivers. So what ended up, they created an alternative. She created an Excel spreadsheet. It was still documenting her efforts. It was able to be accessed by my sister, her direct boss. It was accomplishing the goal, which was communicating with potential drivers and documenting that communication, but in a way that better fit, in a system that was difficult for her to understand and manage. So we want to consider, is there a different way that we could get to the same outcome that's better fit for their skills? You want to also consider, do we need to retrain, but also train in a different way? Maybe there's someone who they verbally heard it, but they actually need to just do it for themselves. And so we need to train them in a way that's them being at the computer, them pushing the buttons, them writing it out, because that's how they're going to better learn. Or do they just need to be retrained, and maybe retrained from someone else in the organization who might be able to train them in a different style than you did initially? For someone who maybe was meeting expectations previously, it's especially important to consider self-care as a driver for not meeting expectations. So if they previously were successful, maybe we need to divert to a self-care plan, and that's the best way for them to be starting to meet expectations again. And then unanticipated barriers. So again, consider what is the actual expectation. So we have a staff member who had some health concerns, caused extreme drowsiness. And so was completing their sessions, but whereas previously they were doing their session note at the end of their session, that tiredness was preventing them from doing that at the end of their session as they used to. So they were coming home and they were falling asleep. And so sometimes they missed that. Well, then they had to kind of retrain, regroup, talk through. Now they come home, they take a quick nap, they get up, they eat their dinner, then they come back to their notes instead of doing it right after. It's still meeting the expectation because the notes are being done within 24 hours, but it was something that they needed to problem solve together, because I was sleeping and then I was forgetting about it. So how do we help you remember to get back to it when there was this unexpected barrier that came up and kind of diverted what was their prior schedule of doing things? So this is my plug for collaborative problem solving. So if you're not familiar with collaborative problem solving, it is a model that Youth Villages uses within all of their programs, within their residential program, their foster care program, Intercept, LifeSet, across the board in several states. So, but it's not owned by Youth Villages. It's a great model for at-risk youth, but it does have application to adults and staff. And so the big philosophy for CPS is that people do well if they can, kids do well if they can. And if they're struggling to meet an expectation, it's because they don't have the skills to manage that expectation. So it's taking out the will of it all. It's not that they're not meeting an expectation because they don't want to, it's they have a skill deficit that's preventing them from meeting the expectation in the way we intended. So um, it is a very like regimented style of problem solving, but it is a great training, and just to be another support for you all if you are continuing to run into these staff who are struggling with expectations using the specific, they call it a plan B conversation, but essentially it's a problem solving conversation of what's getting in the way of you meeting this expectation. How do we come up with some ideas on how you can meet that expectation in the way we intended it to? But overall, none of this happens without having engagement and a relationship with your staff member. That is the foundation to successful leadership and successful team building. If you jump right into training, jump right into directing, you're not going to promote that genuine interest in the person. They're not going to be aligned to that joint goal of successfully serving your clients. They're just going to seem like any other person. So you want to start to just get to know them as a person. What are their interests? What are their dislikes? You can usually tell something by things about people. So if they walk in with a big U t-shirt on, right? What's the background of their cell phone? Do they have children? They mention, right? Kids, people love to talk about their kids. People love to talk about their pets, right? You ask those questions and about something they're generally excited or love. That's going to go a long way. You can take time to share things about yourself as well. Of course, you want to be transparent and kind of join with them. You do not want to overshare though, because it is not all about you, right? So you want to make sure you're taking a genuine interest in them. That also includes, how do they prefer to receive feedback? How do they prefer to receive praise? Because those two things are an important piece of development, providing feedback on things they can improve upon, but also praising them when they're doing well. So understanding how they best like to do that. Maybe they want to receive praise just via an email. Maybe they want to be the one that you stand up in the meeting and shout out, like, Brooke did great this week. And that's like going to really scratch that itch. If you're not familiar with love languages, there is an application for staff acknowledgement. So some staff prefer gifts. Well, we can't necessarily give gifts all the time, but some prefer quality time. Some prefer words of affirmation. So think about that for your staff too. And but also you can directly ask them about how they like to receive praise, and that can go a long way. But it's also important to sprinkle in that praise with the feedback. And then also help them understand what helps them feel valued, helps them feel supported. So if they are having a hard time, do they want you to pick up a session for them? I don't know if that's a possibility within your organization, or would they prefer you to help out in some other way, take some other task off of them? It's really good to understand how they operate, how they feel supported when they aren't operating at 100%. That way you as their leader can step in and support them in the way they feel best supported. All right, we're on to goal 3, but again, that was kind of the like meat and potatoes of everything we were talking about. Any questions that came up from there?
Amber, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second because I remember working at youth villages. Lee used to say some kind of statistic about like your relationship with your direct supervisor and how that promotes one, like job performance, but two, longevity, like in your position. What is it that, do you know what I'm
It's
talking
like
about?
50%. Your relationship with your
Yeah.
supervisor, direct supervisor, is like correlated like 50% with your retention. I don't know if that's actually right, but
And like,
it's like around that.
and just like overall satisfaction, right? Of like your position and
Mhm.
like how long you're willing to stay there. And yeah,
Mhm.
but
Because if
yeah.
you're not feeling supported by the person who's your direct leader, then who is supporting you? And maybe you have a like wealth of staff who are at the same level as them, and they're kind of getting their needs met through those people. But if you're not feeling directly supported by your direct supervisor, then that can feel kind of icky. So. All right. Well, our last stage is we've set those expectations. We've really gathered information on their personal professional goals. Now we're going to um, build on that growth, strengthen their leadership capacity, and hopefully improve your overall organization's effectiveness. So we've set those expectations. Now they're doing, measuring, building. So they're doing what we've talked about. We're measuring their success, and then we're building on their skills. So part of that includes conducting an effective development meeting. So the rhythm of a development meeting is helpful to keep in place even beyond the initial training phase. So you take that time, that first 3 to 5 minutes, to build on your relationship, check in. How was Sally's dance recital last week? Do you have a video to show me, right? It's good to have that relationship building continue. Then you're referencing back to those prior goals. Another reason why it's great to have a development plan, you can just pull out the development plan. Here's all that we worked on last week. Did you have an agenda of something you wanted to add for us to review for this week? Here's my agenda. Hopefully it's kind of in line with what you've already had on the development plan. And then you spend the most of your meeting on a specific development topic. So maybe that is specific training needs still, but maybe it's something really focused on a skill that we're working on building. Maybe they're at that mastery phase. You're teaching them how to do part of your job. So something like that. And then you're using that last part of your development meeting. What's the goal that they are focused on between now and your next development meeting? Development can quickly unravel into a storytelling about a client or a client-specific conversation. Not to say that you can't use your time in that way, but is that actually the development topic that you're focused on? Maybe they are focused on trying to build their skills to support a specific case. But if they're not, is there a meeting that fills that need better? So at Youth Villages, we have group supervision and consultation. So they've actually 2 meetings every week to talk about their clients. And then sometimes our staff love to still come in and talk about their clients, which is great, but that's not what development is for. They have 2 other meetings for that. So we do want to consider, is it unraveling to kind of not be that agenda that we wanted to have focused on? Then we're moving you as the direct manager. You're supporting that doing, measuring, building by making sure the staff are aware of how they're being evaluated on their expectations and skills. So maybe there's some evaluation measures that are on their development plan. Again, maybe there's something that's only reviewed at a performance review, but how are you tracking that? If you don't have one, how can you create one? How can we translate those competencies into an evaluation that could be used in a development day by day, week by week, month by month? Second goal is that you're providing your team members with the information, resources, and skills to meet the expectations. So that might include training opportunities, but maybe you're providing them resources like examples of a note that they need to do or a how-to guide for a part of their job that they need. So you're giving them the resources, the information, so that they can continue to meet those expectations. You're getting helping them with practicing and training skills. So maybe you're using some role play. And again, Youth Villages is more client-centered sessions and therapeutic, but that's not to say that role play can be helpful in a different setting too for a specific skill they're wanting to work on with your clients that they may need some support with. Then the last year, providing those opportunities for growth, new responsibilities outside of their current role after they've mastered their expectations. So that could look like training on your job, training on other leadership opportunities. As the team member, they want to try and prioritize development activities as part of their everyday work week. Development doesn't just happen within your meeting. It goes back to having those specific goal steps that are targeted outside of the development meeting and having specific implementation steps to reference back to in the development meeting when you do come back together. They're attending regularly, so they're prioritizing the meetings. It's not, oh, hey, sorry, I'm going to actually have to cancel this week because I had to meet this client at this specific time. No, you're blocking that calendar invite out. You both are attending weekly. You both are prioritizing each other because that prioritization of the development is important. And then they're sharing honestly so they can continue to work on what are those needs that they're identifying. Your meeting should be a safe environment. So hopefully they're feeling safe enough to be transparent with you about what they see as the things that they're struggling with. And then the last stage is that mastery and skill advancement, so mastery of their job and advancing their other complementary skills. So for leadership development, you want to focus on what are their understanding of your job. What are those parts of the job that they might not see you doing day by day that you can help them understand? Are they aware of other leadership opportunities within your organization? What are the skills that they need in order to be a desirable potential candidate going forward? And helping with succession planning. So that's again that person who can take over your job. Maybe you have to go out unexpectedly on FMLA. Who's the person who can just step up and knows exactly what they need to take over for you? What are those need areas? If they were to take your job, what are some things that they need to work on? Maybe that's the professionalism of how they interact with others. What are the aspects of your job that you can go ahead and teach, and maybe they go ahead and start to cover. You've got a vacation plan, and so they're the one who's going to pass up this information to the higher ups about this specific thing or something that they can do that's a part of your job, so you're not walking back from vacation with a pile of work to do. They've actually covered it for you while you've been out. And then you want to consider leadership opportunities elsewhere as well. So CPS was one I mentioned, and it's not necessarily specifically for leadership, but I do think it has the application for leadership. Youth Villages uses social styles, a lot of the Franklin Covey classes, so leading at the speed of trust, unconscious bias, 7 habits of highly effective people. Those are just a few that come to my head, but I know I started to look into other opportunities. Like the first thing that comes up is Harvard leadership development classes. I can't speak to those, but if there is anything that you're aware of that you've taken as a class and you feel like that was a really amazing leadership, please throw it in the chat, because I think that would be great to hear. And I don't want to recommend something that's thousands of dollars that I've never taken for myself, but I have taken all those Franklin Covey trainings. I do think they're incredibly helpful. CPS I found helpful, social styles. So those are definitely opportunities that you could potentially go to for yourself for your own leadership development, but also refer your staff to as well. Some other ideas to help when they're in the mastery phase. Is there a special project that they can take advantage of? So one of those recently, I'm thinking of staff, they came together and made resource book for staff to reference on how to do different parts of the job. Some other things within our organization, we have Zero Suicide Initiative. So that's people across the organization meet on a monthly basis to talk about strategies for that align with Zero Suicide Initiative. We have wellness ambassadors who are in charge of our step challenges and trying to help our staff be healthier, and things like that that are special, that are definitely not aligned with their job expectations, but are just an extra project that they can invest some time and maybe get some satisfaction out of. Maybe they're someone who would be a great support for training a new staff. They do really great treatment plans. So you're like, I want you to teach Brooke on how to do a treatment plan because I couldn't teach it any better than you could. You do a better job than I could. So thinking about how you can involve them, and when you're bringing on even newer staff, supporting their critical thinking. So maybe they call you with a question and you're like, I think they have the answer to this. And so instead of just giving them the answer, what do you think about that? What would you do? What are some thoughts that you have? And so prompting them to try and solve some problems for themselves or answer their questions for themselves is building that leadership skill so that they don't need you as much. Again, you kind of want to work yourself out of a job, hopefully, where they're kind of independently successful. And then helping their licensure professional goals. Again, that might not necessarily tie back to their job, but it is something that benefits the organization long-term as well. So we'll wrap up with some next steps. So if you're not consistently meeting with your staff, I would start there. How can we get on a rhythm that feels in line of what is doable for you, but it communicates that it's important to you that you're meeting with your staff regularly? What are some assessment tools that you might be able to utilize more frequently, or you might need to create in order to have that ongoing assessment and feedback to your staff about how they're doing with meeting different job expectations? If you're not documenting your meetings, go ahead and figure out what's a development plan look like for you. Do you need to kind of look at a template of something, or is there something that you could create that outlines that agenda, those meeting notes, but also is a place for you to track those goals and steps? And then if you're not already working on developing your team members to take your job, I definitely want to encourage you to do that, because you do want to support your staff to be able to move on, whether that's into your job eventually or beyond, and in a different leadership role within your organization or outside of your organization. And I think that's our last slide. Somehow we made it all the way to 1:59, which doesn't give us a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to stay on a few extra minutes for anybody who has any questions for me.
Of course. Thanks so much, Amber. And yeah, feel free to put any questions that you all have in the chat or come off mute for the last few minutes that we have. But I did want to mention, Amy said in the chat, Healing Trust does a really good succession planning workshop. So that's cool. I'll put that in the follow-up notes. Thank you, Amy, for giving us that. And Sierra said, thank you so much for today. It was very helpful. I'll also send you all the slides too, because I know there's a lot of steps and a lot of things to think about when you're developing, plans and documentation and things like that. So I will make sure y'all get these slides too. Monica says, thank you. I did want to just mention too, one question that I had, Amber, that maybe you can talk about is when you think about like staff mastering things and putting them on special projects or giving them, things to help their professional development, how do you draw the line between what may be asking too much of that person and like their role creep so that they take on too many things, and what's like for their own professional development, if you can speak to that?
Well, I think that goes back to the transparency of like for the staff, what do they feel like is reasonable for them to take on? Because you don't want to assign something that feels too overwhelming. So what do they feel like is realistic to do? And then having that consistent check-in of like, you started to, one of my old position expectation or like mastery type things was starting to do like assessments for other programs and doing the write-ups, and then like I went from doing one a month to doing four in a month, and I was like, well, actually that's probably too much, right? So it's probably something that that check-in along the way could have helped before we got to that stage of this is overwhelming. But hopefully that's something you've kind of established when I assign that mastery thing. Here's my plan. You're going to start, this is the training, this is when you're going to start doing that. I'm going to check in with you next week. I'm going to check in with you in 2 weeks. And we're going to keep checking in to see, is this still something you feel like is helpful for you? Or is this becoming too much? And hopefully you kind of set that foundation of transparency to help with that.